let's see
Okay.
here. I'm recording it now, so we're good. Would you like to give me the permission to record? Let's see.
I mean, it's fine. It's already recording.
Yeah, and I'm
Sure.
happy to share this afterwards.
It's already recording, so I
Exactly.
believe we're good.
Oh, there he is. Hey, Pico.
Hey, what's
All
up?
right. Good. I'll just go quiet, and then I'll let you guys be and let David take over, and hopefully speak a discussion.
Cool. Hi, everyone. Sorry for being late. Does anyone on our side give an introduction already or nothing?
Not yet.
Not right?
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks, team. As I told you over email, David, we've been working with David and James for a couple of months now. They are helping us. They helped us build our first POC around the data and what we have on the recordings and speech to text and all that. And every time that David presented on a weekly basis what he and the team have been working on, I found it super interesting and really cool. So I thought it was good for David to share all this because again, you'll see it's super cool. So that's the idea, just to spend some time with him and learn from him and learn what he and the team have been doing on the past months. And that's it. And thanks a lot, David and James for this time.
Oh, you're welcome. Can someone enable screen sharing? I don't know who the host is.
That's me.
Okay.
Wait a minute. Screen sharing is. Oh yeah, here you go. Sorry, my bad. There you go.
That's okay.
You're good to go.
Select window or screen. Oh gosh, I don't know. Okay, let's try screen. Just bear with me a second. Just check this. Screen, entire screen. I'll just do that. It's a lot easier. Okay.
There we go.
You can probably see yourself, so let me do this instead. I think I hit F5. There we go. Okay, so I'm hoping that you're, ready to ask questions and so on as I talk through this. I'm trying to give a sort of overview of some of the areas that we worked on, but I'm more than happy to discuss in more detail if you like about any of the areas that we're talking about. Let me hide this. So let's start with the data that we had to work with. In this case, we started with several audio files that come from a single conversation between a patient and a doctor. The files have some kind of GUID file name. They're encoded, and we'll talk a bit more about the encoding format. And there's MKA files. We'll talk about what that is. And then we also have the start time when that audio file was first, when the start of the audio for that file, how long it is, and who the speaker is. And so that's the data that we have to start with. And the goal is to essentially transcribe this entire conversation into a solution that we can, where doctors can actually read the text, they can search within the text, and they can play the audio alongside it as well. We suddenly jumped into the audio. So this is what the audio file looks like. The audio is encoded as MKA files. That is Matroska format. It's an open source format used for video and audio encoding. And it's really just a envelope or a wrapper file, a bit like AVI, and MPEG for that matter. It doesn't really tell you how the file is encoded. It just tells you how the packets are stored within the data, so that you can, if you know what the encoder is, you can then decode the audio. So it's just a file format essentially for storing encoded audio. The encoding itself is encoded using a codec called Opus, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But before we do that, I wanted to show you, once you decode the audio for one of these files, and I believe it's probably the first one here, the first one from the patient. So this is about 18 minutes of audio. This is what it looks like. And when you first look at this, you can see that there's speech, and then there's maybe some silence, and there's speech. It turns out that this file, if you played it end to end, would essentially, apart from this pause at the beginning where the patient is actually waiting for the doctor to join, doctor joins about here, would essentially sound like the patient talked non-stop throughout the whole time. And one of the challenges with the Opus codec is that it's used for voice over IP, and therefore it has quite a lot of aggressive things done to the audio in order to minimize the amount of data that's transmitted. And one of the things that they do in order to reduce the audio transmission is what's happening right now in this conversation, in that I'm the person speaking, everybody else is being silent. There's no need to transmit everybody else's audio. And so they very aggressively remove silences from within the conversation. The challenge, of course, is that we have separate files for the doctor and the patient, and we would like to reconstruct the conversation the way it was spoken originally, so that we can figure out when the patient was saying what, and what the doctor had asked, and what the answer comes from the patient, and so on. And so the first thing that we have to do is to try to figure out how to unwind all of this and find information within the audio file itself that will help us understand where all the spaces or all the silences were in the text. Another problem is that there is often packet drops, especially in this case from the patient. And so these are cases where bits of audio get lost, either because the device wasn't fast enough to encode it all, or because they're probably more likely their Wi-Fi or their network connection wasn't very reliable. And rather than drop the call completely, the signal degrades down to lower and lower bandwidth to try to at least get something across. And I'm sure you've all heard in conference calls when the sound starts sounding like a robot. This happens several times during this conversation. And you will also notice from this audio that there are times when, even though the patient is speaking, they're actually speaking exactly the same as at this point here, except that for some reason, presumably they're pointing their head a long way away from the microphone, or they put their hand over their phone or something like that. And so these are still speech, it's just that it's in some cases very, very quiet. And so we have to deal with that problem as well. There's not a lot of noise in the background, like there's no cars driving by or jackhammers out in the street, but there is still a little bit of noise, and there's certainly a case during the patient's side of the audio where the patient receives a phone call and they happen to have their phone sitting on a desk, and obviously they're talking from their phone, and so you hear this very loud vibrating buzzing sound as well as their ringtone from the phone. So let's talk first of all about the codec. As I mentioned, this is an Opus codec. Opus codec history comes from Skype. The original creators of Skype designed a more efficient codec specifically for chatting online, for, in this case, originally for audio. This has evolved now into an open source codec called the Opus codec, which is pretty much the standard way for doing video over IP communication in pretty much every app, including Zoom that we're talking on at the moment, and Teams and so on. It's also included within iOS and Android, and so therefore virtually every mobile app that does any kind of audio communication, any chatting, it tends to use the codec. The phone companies themselves don't use this codec for their own audio, but it's used for internet audio in particular. One of the advantages of it is that it has the potential to encode very high quality audio, at least as good as MP3. And at the same time, it can encode very low bitrate audio when there is a poor connection and still be reasonably intelligible. So it does that by varying the bit rate. It does its best to compress everything it hears, and so the amount that is transmitted per sentence or per word or part of word depends entirely on how easy the algorithm found to compress it. So you're not getting, a certain number of bytes per second when you receive the audio. The amount of data that you receive can vary significantly. It can be even sometimes 4 or 5 times greater than other times. The audio is stored in 16-bit resolution, and it is stored as if it was sampled at 48 sorry, it's not 48,000 kilohertz. That should be 48 kilohertz. Apologies. Which, if you don't know much about the audio, the highest sound that humans are supposed to be able to hear is roughly around 20 kilohertz. And we sample at twice that frequency or more than twice that frequency in order to avoid aliasing. It's Nyquist sampling theory. And so in this case, the 48 kilohertz is more than twice 20 kilohertz, which should be enough to record pretty much any sound that humans could hear. The reality is the only people who can hear anything close to 20 kilohertz are usually in their teens. And by the time you're in your mid-20s, your hearing degrades significantly. By the time you're my age, you probably can't hear it at all. But that's why 48 kilohertz is the sample rate that's used for DVDs, and 44 kilohertz for CDs. And I think 48 kilohertz also for digital radio. So this is a fairly standard sample rate. Studios will tend to record at a higher sample rate, usually double that, so 96 kilohertz, and in some cases above 100 kilohertz when they're recording for music or video or something in a studio, or for a movie or a commercial movie. In this case, the audio, even though it's just a single speaker and they're talking probably over a single mono microphone, the audio that we receive in the file arrives as 2-channel stereo audio. It turns out that both the left and right channels are identical, but at least in the files that we receive, the bytes for each of those channels are fully populated within the file. So it's not clear to me whether the stereo is actually being sent from the device over the internet, or whether it just happens to be the way that it's stored in the file, so that when you unpack it, you end up with the stereo audio. But obviously this means that in order to extract the WAV file, we need to take out every other value, and therefore we have to process all of the audio, extract just one of the channels, and then process that. They are exactly identical byte for byte, so we don't lose anything by moving them, and we don't have to merge them in any way. One of the ways that the Opus codec can achieve both high quality, high fidelity audio encoding as well as very low bit rate, low quality, is because it cheats. It has 2 codecs built into it. It has a codec that records the lower frequencies, usually are under 12 kilohertz, and it has another codec that tends to record. It's not quite as cut and dried as this. There's not quite there's such a clear separation, but essentially, because of the way it filters, there's an overlap. But essentially, below 12 kilohertz, it's using a different codec than at higher frequencies. And this higher frequency one is comparable or better to the sort of encoding that you would get from fairly low compression rate MP3s. So you can record like an orchestra or something like that if you wanted to, but in general it's mostly used for low bandwidth audio encoding, and it's extremely good at that. As I already mentioned, one of the issues that we have to deal with is that there's a lot of silence removal, and so in order to reproduce the original audio, we have to go through and unpack all of that and reconstruct it. There is also error correction, so there are some you can configure the codec so that it stores a little bit of extra information, so that if when it's received by the recipient it doesn't make sense, there's some extra bytes in the data that may help them reconstruct the audio. and you may hear this. I don't think it happens as much on Zoom, but on Teams, if someone's signal drops and then recovers, you sometimes hear them talking twice as fast until they catch up. And so that's part of what they're trying to achieve using this error correction. So you're trying to keep the audio in sync as well as to try to keep it in pitch. So you can't just double the speed of audio and play the bytes twice as fast, because it would sound like a chipmunk. So you have to adjust all the frequencies when you play it faster. And the error correction codes help with that and help to kind of give you an idea of what the sounds might have occurred. And we hopefully will hear what some of those are in a minute when we play some of the audio. This is a spectrogram of the audio taken from a section of speech to give you an idea of what it looks like. We already seen what it looks like as a wave file. This is what it looks like in the frequency spectrum. So what you're seeing along the x-axis is time. So each one of these things is a word that's been spoken, where you see all these bright spots. And then up along here is the frequency of the audio that was recorded. So up here, this is 20 kilohertz. Down here, it's 4 kilohertz. Most speech will tend to be under 6 kilohertz in general. It's lower for men than for women. And in fact, women and children are roughly similar pitch. And then the other thing you'll notice is that it looks like there's a sort of pattern here where there are gaps, and then there's a signal, and then there are gaps, and they seem to be sort of evenly spread out. And this is because all these sounds are produced by the way the sound travels through from your voice box through your mouth and throat and nose. And each time the size of the cavity changes, there is a reflection in the audio that causes additional frequencies to be added, and those tend to be multiples of the lowest frequency. So they should all be fairly evenly spaced. If there are other sounds, then there's often because there's more than one sound source, like for example, someone's nose is whistling or something like that. But in general, you will expect them to be fairly evenly distributed and a multiple of the lowest, or what we call the formant frequency of the sound. If you played music, you would probably see the same thing. If you play a guitar string, it doesn't just play the single note that matches the length of that string. It also plays notes that are twice the frequency and 4 times the frequency and 8 times the frequency and so on. And that's what gives the sound its richness. To give you an idea of what a sound would be like if it only had one frequency, then you just whistle. That's probably the closest you can get easily to make a sound. But if you hear like a straight sine wave, like you'll know what a single pitch sounds like. It's nothing like how a human would speak. So all of these things are caused entirely by the way the sound travels through your vocal cavity, if you like. And then there are some sounds that are produced that are just sudden sounds, like the P's and T's and D's and so on, where there is a sudden what's called a plosive sound. And those tend to be very short. Vowel sounds tend to be longer. And so most of the time where you clearly see these patterns in the signal here, that is where vowels are being pronounced. And where you see just a sort of narrow stripe and it's almost all the one color, that is more likely to be like an S or a T or a P or some consonant. And when you're doing speech recognition, in general, it's very difficult to say a T that lasts a long time. Right, you tend to repeat the T, but vowel sounds can vary quite a lot in the length. And so the speech recognition algorithms have to take into account that not every sound that we produce takes the same amount of time. And so we use these sort of time varying models in order to represent the audio that would match against the speech. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But this gives you an idea of what the spectrum, the frequencies that look like when every time you speak, this is what's happening to signal that's produced out of your mouth, which in turn is causing the air to vibrate, which then transmits the sound, and somebody else then hears it, and then it goes into your ear, and your ear has the opposite thing. It has little hairs inside the cochlea that actually detect sounds at different frequencies. The hairs themselves are at different lengths, and the cochlea itself is a sort of snail-like wrapped up conical section where it gets narrower and narrower, and therefore you hear high frequencies when the signal is small, and you hear the low frequencies only when big things move. To give you an idea of the size of these waves, the sort of low frequencies that you hear from, say, a subwoofer in a hi-fi, those could be several meters long, right? So if you think about the gap between your ears, being able to tell a point in a waveform that's several meters long is very difficult. And so that's why you may note that a subwoofer, you can put it almost anywhere in the room and it sounds the same. And that's because we can't actually tell where low frequency sounds come from, because the waves are too big. They're much bigger than the size of our head. But most of the stereo positioning that we detect when we try to locate things that we're listening to, like I was trying to find my cat this evening, they tend to be listening for high-pitched sounds like bells and S sounds, and so it's a lot easier to hear. So if you ever want to set a ringtone on your phone and you want to know where your phone is, try to make sure that you have some high-pitched sounds on your ringtone, because it'll be a lot easier to find your phone than if it's a sort of a low bass sound. You'll never find your phone. You'll just hear it playing and get very frustrated. So one last thing I want to point out inside here, I mentioned that there were two codecs in the Opus codec, and you can clearly see here, in fact, I think I have another slide with the lines. I've drawn some lines where you can clearly see that there is a very stark, sudden jump in the amplitude or the strength of the waveform at certain frequencies, especially around 12 kilohertz. And this is because you're swapping from one codec to the next. But there is also one around 8,000 kilohertz, and then there's another one at 16,000 kilohertz, where most of the audio gets cut off. Now, in this case, this cutoff of the audio is likely to be the device itself, the phone itself that's cut off the audio. The 12 kilohertz is the swap between the two codecs in Opus, and the 8 kilohertz is actually to do with the algorithm that's trying to predict or trying to minimize the audio that needs to be sent, and sometimes it decides that it doesn't need to send much of the signal above 8 kilohertz in order to still send clear audio. And so you see sometimes little bits that these are sort of filters that are cutting in order to try to figure out whether or not to encode some of this lower frequency audio. The worst case scenario, if the signal drops a lot, you would try as hard as possible to preserve this low section here. The upper section can disappear, but the low section really needs to be kept. The other thing that we need to do is, once we've expanded out all the audio and inserted all the silences, we still have to go and detect the true silences, including the ones that were encoded. And a more reliable way of doing that is actually to get rid of all the sounds above a certain frequency, like 4 kilohertz, because we know this, if someone is speaking, there must be sound at around 4 kilohertz. Otherwise, it wouldn't sound like speech. And that enables us to get rid of all the other background noise that might be happening, like cars driving by or wind noise or something like that. And therefore, we can more accurately determine where someone is speaking. And we need to be able to do that because we want to be able to align the audio in the file to the text that is being spoken. So one of the things that I mentioned was that this audio all these silences get stripped out and we get packet losses. And so there is no easy way to figure that out from your typical audio media player. What we have to do is analyze every single frame, and there are hundreds of thousands of these frames within every audio file, and figure out what their start time was, how long they were, how many bytes were within the packet, the duration time that for that particular packet. Most of the packets should be 20 milliseconds long, based on the way this audio was originally encoded, and it's fairly typical for Opus codecs to use a 20 millisecond like frame duration. So that means that every 20 milliseconds something gets sent. It's packed up, and then that 20 milliseconds get packaged off and sent across the internet, and then it starts working on the next 20 milliseconds, and then that gets sent. And so there's always at least a 20 millisecond delay between when someone is speaking, plus all the network delay in between. And so in a perfect scenario, you would see all of these being 20 milliseconds with an exact packed size of data that fills that 20 milliseconds. But it turns out that that's not always the case, and so we have to go through all of these numbers and try to reverse engineer. You can see 960 samples at 20 milliseconds is essentially 48 kilohertz stereo. You can see there's 2 channels encoded in this audio file, and we use FFmpeg, which is probably the most popular audio kind of manipulation library out there. And it's also the highest performing manipulation library that is able to go through and extract this. But it does mean that we have to take files that are often hundreds of megabytes long and churn through them and extract all of this data, process all this data, and process every packet, and then reconstruct all of that packet to rebuild the audio. And this is a chart here of the packet size. You can see that, as I mentioned before, the codec doesn't try to encode in the same number of bytes for every packet. It tries to encode with the minimum number of bytes necessary to encode that packet. And so it varies significantly. On average, I guess it's somewhere around here, around sort of 45. But it can vary quite a bit. And sometimes it's struggling here because this is technically silence, but I believe the patient is playing with paper or doing something or making sounds or something, but it's not speech. And so the codec is having a bit of difficulty deciding what to do, whether it should encode it or not, or should I encode it or not. And you'll find that there are packets with almost nothing in it, followed by a packet with stuff in it, followed by a packet with nothing in it. And it's clearly the algorithm is having difficulty deciding what to do with the audio. And then this is a timeline showing you a lot on the x-axis along time, and on the y-axis how much data is being transmitted. And you can see, on the y-axis is the time interval in between, and so it jumps suddenly roughly around here because the patient gets a call from their lawyer or something like that, and they're quiet for a while because they're answering their phone. You don't hear very much, and then they start talking again. And each time it's steady is because there's a lot of data, and then there's a gap, and then it's steady, and then there's a gap, and then it's steady, and there's a gap. And that's usually because they're listening to the doctor, and then they're speaking, and then they're quiet, and then they're speaking, and they're quiet, and they're speaking. Right? And so this is an analysis of the frame gaps. These are this is trying to figure out where within a very short piece of audio, so this is only like 1,000 frames out of probably around a couple of 100,000 frames or more, where the gaps are that are caused either that usually these full gaps are where the algorithm determined that it was pure silence, and therefore that there was no need to encode anything. And then these other gaps are where there is a loss of packet data. So more data was encoded than was received, and so there's a packet loss, and we have to reconstruct that also. Because we want to be able to align precisely the doctor and the patient, and they're in separate audio files. And so we have to reconstruct. We do that by just inserting silence where we see this, but you can do, because these are very brief, there is no obvious way to do it that much better than just insert a silence. I mean, these are very brief few millisecond pauses. But if this was more significant, we could try to filter out. The danger is that any audio processing that we do to the signal will affect the sound that the speech recognizer will hear. And so our ideal world is just to insert silence there rather than to try to invent a sound wasn't really in the original audio in the hope that it might be close to what someone said. That does seriously confuse the speech recognizer, and it will make more mistakes. Here is a sample of the original audio, and here is the same sample aligned. So you can see this piece here, there was obviously quite a bit of silence in this section, so it moved along. And then by the time we get to this piece, we've now moved quite a long way along the file. And then this piece has now been moved over to here. So we're gradually spreading out this whole file, and it will end up being substantially higher, probably around anything from 5 to 20 times longer than the original sound. Obviously depends on how much silence is in the audio. But in this case, we have a conversation where, you know, one person is speaking, and usually the other person is silent, and then the other person speaks. So in theory, you would think that all we'd have to do is match them up and find all the gaps in one and all the speaking bits in the other, and they should match up like a jigsaw puzzle. But it doesn't work like that, because first of all, they quite frequently speak at the same time. And the other problem is that the doctor seems to have a preference for typing very loudly. And so there are many cases in the doctor's audio where the silences are replaced, or are not removed, but instead the audio of the doctor clicking the keys is present. So it's not trivial to just auto-align it. But fortunately, we start with some guide as to where these files are aligned. If you notice, going back to one of the first slides I showed with all the files, there was one file for the doctor and several files for the patient. And those are caused because the patient tried, well, connected, disconnected, then couldn't hear the doctor, so reconnected, then could hear the doctor, but the doctor said they couldn't see them, so they reconnected. And then for some reason reconnected again. And each time they reconnect, there's another audio file, which of course is not in line with the sound that's coming from the doctor. So we resolve all of those. The next thing we have to do is to figure out where all the silence is, because we want to be able to represent this audio as text, and therefore we need to know when a sentence was spoken, when was it spoken, so that we can interleave the conversation the way it was spoken. And to do that, we have to be able to accurately identify periods during which some speech was made, and make some determination as to when the gap is sufficiently long that perhaps they were pausing and they're now saying a different sentence, or they're waiting for the doctor to finish speaking. And so here's an example of the output from the algorithm. The green lines here indicate where the phrase starts, and then there's a red line indicating the end. And in this case, because this graph is quite compressed up, the next phrase starts almost immediately and ends here, and then the next phrase starts and ends over here. And this is designed to allow for the fact that in a normal conversation, people tend to pause. So it's not tracking every possible silence, it's trying to figure out at what point is it likely that there was a deliberate pause. And this algorithm is actually, I'll play you some sounds to let you hear how well it actually goes through and identifies where all of those phrases are. The second reason why we want to be able to do that is that the speech recognition algorithms are quite processor and memory intensive. And if we can process a phrase at a time, there's no loss in fidelity of the transcription, but it allows us to run it on a much lower powered and potentially lower RAM and lower CPU machine. So in fact, some of these files could be an hour long of stereo audio from both the doctor and the patient, could be in the sort of up to a gigabyte. And by the time they're expanded and turned and transcribed into a format that is fed into some of these AI models, you could be talking about 20 to 40 gigabytes of data being fed through the model. And so even a high-end GPU is going to struggle trying to process an entire audio file at a time. So if we can do it at little pieces at a time, it makes our life a lot easier. And obviously, it enables us to align the text as well. So this is it at a sort of much narrower sample, exactly the same. So you can see the gaps where it found the beginning and end of each of the phrases. And then the next thing that we have to do is, once we've detected all of the silences and all the packet losses and reconstructed all the audio, is then to align the audio between the doctor and the patient so that we can play it side by side. And the end result is produced as a single MP3 file that we can play in the browser. We can stream individual parts of this to the browser, and you can hear the doctor's conversation on the right ear and the patient on the left ear, I believe. But it could be easy to swap. But essentially, it allows you to hear the conversation that way, and that helps because often they will speak at the same time. So it's nice to know that you can, just hear through one ear and say, well, hear what the doctor said, instead of trying to hear the combined sound from both. And you can see here, this is what the audio looks like for a very small sample, just a single, interaction between the doctor and the patient, where the doctor said something, then the patient said something, then the doctor said something. And during this time, the doctor tapped their keyboard, and you can see the doctor's tapping their keyboard all the way through here as well. And then the patient is speaking, and then the doctor speaks again. I don't know, let me know if you can hear this. I hope you can.
I can't hear anything, David.
Yeah,
You
no,
can't?
very low.
Yeah, I don't know whether
Well,
this is
there's
going to be
actually a way
any.
to do this. Let me go continue, and I'll figure this out.
I
don't know if you
think
can-
my.
I don't know if you can put a microphone next to other speaker. That may work.
No, because it's coming through my ears,
Yeah,
phones.
that's true. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Let's see. There's a way to do this.
I know what I can do. I can, in fact, change my speaker, I believe. Let me turn this on and see. Can I do this? Is this going to work? Let me see if I play this again.
Muy bien, ¿y usted?
There we go.
Sí, correcto. 60. ¿Perdón? 030361. Separada de un proceso de divorcio. Guadalajara, Jalisco. Casi no la escucho, doctora. No, un poquito, casi igual, pero yo le subí a mi teléfono el sonido. Déjame ver. A ver. No sé si esté ahora mejor el sonido, pero bueno.
Okay, that's probably enough for now. I hope you get the idea. So those beeps were inserted into the audio. Just bear with me a sec. I'll change my speaker back to. How do I do this? Let me see. Oh no. What is going on here? Okay, I'm back here. Audio. Why can't I do this? Here. This is what I want to change. Okay. Can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, so I was just changing because the other one's like a speaker phone thing, and you probably can't hear very well from that. So hopefully you could hear. In that case, what we did was insert the high-pitched beep at the start of the phrase, and then a lower-pitched beep at the end of the phrase, and then just squashed together all the phrases that the patient spoke. And we do that to test that the algorithms are actually correctly segmenting the phrases within the speech. And once we've done that and we can do that reliably, then we can recognize each of those phrases independently and then align those with when the doctor spoke and when the patient spoke so that we get them working side by side. So that once we've done, are there any questions so far? I keep talking. Please feel free to interrupt.
I think we're good.
Does anybody have any questions? Why is it trying to? Okay. No. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can
Okay.
hear you.
Yeah, I think no questions for now.
Okay, fine. Hopefully, oh, look, I was watching a YouTube video. There we go. Okay, never mind. Let's see.
The very good audio fundamentals.
Yeah. Okay.
Explain why we do what we do.
Yeah, I mean, the hope is that this is interesting and you understand more than if I just sort of presented some output text or something like that. And to understand, what we have to do in order to get this to work. Okay, let me. Oh no, I don't want to do that. How do I go back to the one I wanted? Does that? Let's skip that. Slideshow, play from current slide. Okay. So, this is another example of what I showed you before, but it's probably a bit clearer, showing both the waveform, in this case the patient speaking, and this is the spectrogram, but in much prettier colors, showing you what the sound looks like relative to that waveform. So this is the frequency spectrum, this is time going along the x-axis, frequency going along here, and this is just a normal waveform with time along the x-axis and amplitude. And you can see that there's quite a dense sort of waveform here, and that matches with the sounds that the patient is saying. You can even see here where the patient is saying something and the vowels are going up and down in frequency. I currently, in case you don't know, I currently live in Vietnam, and the Vietnamese language is a tonal language, which means that meh, 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 and meh are all completely different words. And they only different because there is very, very, very subtle difference in the way in which the word is pronounced. They're spelled almost exactly the same, except for an accent or an up and down tone or a wave tone. And so, using this, we can actually detect the changes in pitch during the frequency, and they tend to only happen during vowel sounds. It's very hard to change pitch during a consonant. So it's another indication. And certain words, especially in English, probably less so in Spanish, but certainly in English, tend to be like hello is very different than hello. And the only real difference is the change in pitch between the words, so we can actually tell, even with the same word, how it was pronounced. In Spanish, fortunately, a lot of the language, the vowel sounds tend to be much more straightforward. A, E, I, O. There is not as quite the same variety as in English, so it should, in theory, make it easier to recognize speech in Spanish. But there are several things against us. There's less people building Spanish models, so a lot of the most sophisticated speech recognition models are in English. The main problem with Spanish is because it is perhaps slightly simpler in its phonetic content. And for the record, I was actually born and brought up in Colombia, and Spanish is my first language, so maybe I should be presenting in Spanish. But so because the phonetic content in Spanish is somewhat simpler than in English, the result is that Spanish speakers often speak a lot faster, and therefore we have other problems that we'll address in a minute. So the speech recognition pipeline itself, we do some audio cleaning. In this case, the audio, the background sounds weren't very loud, but there are some issues, as you saw with or heard even in the audio, where there are clearly distortions in the audio due to packet drops or encoding limitations. Once we've done that, we're extracting features, and by features, what we're doing is looking for these kind of common patterns within the speech where there's a period of time where there's a similar pattern that's occurring for that period of time, which is indicative of a particular kind of vowel sound, and the different frequencies you can see here. For example, there's a period where there's no frequency here, but there is one here and one here. This is because it's a different sound and it's produced in a different way by your mouth and your throat and your nose. And yet down here it's very similar to over here, so it's likely that this could be something like an ah, and this is an ah, and then there's might be some other sound in the middle, where the mouth is in a different position and therefore doesn't reflect this particular sound. And so using that, we can turn that into a representation of speech that is closer to phonemes, to word sounds that we hear. And so that's what this feature extraction process is doing, is it's filtering out this audio in order to try to figure out what sound did we make. Did we make a T or a P or an R or an E or an E? And then taking the output of this feature extraction, which is really just a sort of signal measurement, and then trying to turn that into a recognition of actual phonemes that were spoken or parts of speech. And not parts of speech, anyway, whatever. And individual sounds within the speech is what I mean. And then once we do that, we look at combinations of those in order to figure out how those might be reconstructed as words, and then looking at pairs, triples, sometimes even 4 words in a row to see how likely those are, in order to try to figure out whether which of the candidate words that are possible is most likely. And then it gets processed through a grammar analyzer that figures out if what we've recognized makes sense in the language. And then finally, it's trying to figure out, based on all the audio that we've heard recently, is this going to be a sentence? When does the sentence finish, and does the sentence tend to make sense? So there's quite a lot of analysis. Some of this is really linguistic analysis. It's understanding Spanish grammar and Spanish words rather than audio. The kind of audio phase stops around here and turns into language models from then on. Now, in this case, we're using a speech recognizer from Facebook called, it's not called Wave to Vec, it should be called Wave to Text. Wave to Vec is something else, apologies. Let me just correct that, because that's embarrassing. It is still 3 letters, but okay. And just so in case you want to look it up, that's what it is. And Wave to Text, the idea behind this is somewhat different from traditional speech recognizers, which try to model language the way linguists thought about language, and try to think about it in terms of the spectrum that I showed you earlier. Wave to Text does it a different way, and it says, okay, let's skip the frequency analysis altogether, and let's just try to figure out if we could build a model that only looked at this. I only looked at the change in the audio in the raw waveform, encoded it in such a way that if we analyze little sections of this and analyze them over and over again, and then overlap them a little bit, eventually we will get some output that tells us something that is common enough in speech that hopefully we can represent it as some proxy or some representation of what humans tend to use phonemes to represent. And so that's how this thing does. What this thing does is a neural network that is taking input from sequences of samples in the original audio file. These funnels don't really match this length of speech. Typically, for this number of funnels, you'd be talking about a section that's less than 1 millimeter wide here. So this is probably several 100,000 samples, and each of these is probably only looking at 40 or 50 samples. So this entire thing would really be compressed up into a tiny section here. But what it's doing is it's outputting a vector representation, essentially a set of 40 numbers, and which one of those numbers is the largest usually represents the likely candidate for what sound was made. So it's looking for 40 different things at the same time and combinations of those 40 things. And once you've got them, it goes into this other AI model, a transformer model, which then tries to figure out, given these 40 outputs from the audio that I've heard, what is the likely sequence of characters that would be output from that? And it doesn't do a lot more sophistication beyond that. In fact, I've written down the words, the sort of sounds that match the text that you see above. So that's se puso malo y después. Right? This is what matches down here. And this is what the transformer would output. The challenge is that we can't use information inside the speech recognizer to tell us where we are in the audio file. Because by the time it goes through this transformer, we no longer have any indication that the A sound was somewhere here in the audio. And so the only way we can do that to figure out which sentences in the text match which parts of the audio is to pre-chop up the audio and then send it through this thing and then figure out what the output was for that small section. So if I wanted to know what this word was or what this blob here of audio was, I would chop it out from all the other sound, feed it through this algorithm, and see which word or series of sounds or letters would come out from it. There's no way inside here. So that's one of the challenges that we have to deal with when we're trying to accurately identify specific parts of speech and match up, in particular where, for example, there are errors in the speech and trying to figure out whether they're caused by either a loss in audio quality, or is it to do with the way the patient pronounced the word, or is it that they're not speaking clearly into the microphone and so on. It is quite difficult to match up. But the big advantage of this approach over a traditional speech recognizer is that it keeps trying its best to output something. The problem with the model that I mentioned here, which is very sophisticated and is based on a lot of decades and decades of research in how language works, by linguists, right? Learning how Spanish and English differ from each other and their origins, and Latin and Germanic origins, all that kind of stuff. That's, people have been studying that for years, and that information was used with the assumption that that's an efficient way to represent language. This algorithm is the opposite. It's just brute force saying, okay, there's some variation in amplitude of some signal, and that somehow turns into characters. And the magic all seems to happen inside here because we train it with a very large amount of data. So some of these challenges that we have to deal with is all speech recognition models, including wave to text and including all traditional speech recognition models, are trained for the most part from speech where you give somebody a piece of paper with a sentence to say and they speak that sentence. Or you give them a word to say and they speak that word. But we're particularly interested in continuous speech. So typically you would give somebody a number of sentences and then turn the recorder on, and then they would read those sentences and you'd match them to the text. And then later on, when you train the speech recognition model, you say, this was the audio, this is the text that was spoken, go and figure out how the audio matches the text. And that's essentially what learning to recognize speech is all about in a computer. The problem is that people reading from a piece of text, and especially reading from a piece of text and talking into a microphone, don't speak anything like the way they speak in a normal conversation. And so if you listen to the doctor and certainly the patient speaking, I can't imagine the patient trying to talk to Alexa or Cortana or Siri or someone the way that she speaks to the doctor. We tend to speak in a very artificial way. And so the speech recognizers learn that. And it means that if you want to subtitle a newsreader, and YouTube can do that automatically, they will tend to be very accurate. But if you subtitle a conversation between two friends, YouTube or the Google speech recognizer starts falling apart. It doesn't do a very good job because people don't speak the same way as the algorithm was trained. So one of the issues we have to deal with is that all of our conversations are people speaking in a different way to the way in which these language models have been trained. I already mentioned, people speak differently when they speak into a machine. And you might notice if next time you listen to yourself speaking to Siri or Alexa or something, you're probably a bit more self-conscious about the fact that you speak to it different than you would speak to, say, a child or someone else. And the conversation speech tends to be very different. There's a lot more use of pauses and hesitations and intonations that you would never use during speech. There is a lot of cases where you speak suddenly very quickly, or where the volume changes up and down, where the pitch of the voice changes up and down, especially if you're under stress, which could be caused sometimes during a conversation with a doctor where somebody might be particularly upset or in pain. And so we have to deal with that. Speech recognition don't understand what that's all about. There are some other issues, as I mentioned. The Spanish language, unfortunately, is not the language which is the #1 language for building speech models. So it tends to be the models for Spanish language are often smaller and less precise and have less training data than those for English, and substantially so. It's hundreds of times more data, maybe thousands of times more data. So we have to deal with that issue. As I'm sure you know, there's a wide variation in pronunciation across different countries in Latin America, never mind between Spain and Latin America. And so we have to accommodate those. People can speak very fast in Spanish, and when they speak very fast, they often simply just miss out bits of words or merge words together. And that makes it difficult for the speech recognizer because it's looking for a word, and yet the patient didn't actually say the word. So it's impossible unless it understood what the patient meant and had some understanding of medical terms and what someone is talking about. It would be difficult to infer what they said because the transcription is very accurate relative to what they said, but it's not accurate against what the patient really was the words they were trying to express but didn't pronounce properly. One of the other challenges we have is that we often see medical terms, we see names of drugs, we see names of illnesses, and the domain in which this speech is happening is not the normal everyday conversation. And so a speech recognizer might never have seen, and probably will never have seen, half of all the possible drug names that could be mentioned in a conversation with a doctor. And so we have to find a way to reconstruct the audio that the speech recognizer couldn't understand and figure out whether they were mentioning the name of a drug or an illness or something like that might not have been in the dictionary for the speech recognizer. And I've already mentioned some of these other issues. The quality varies a lot. In this case, nobody's sitting, well, the doctor, I guess, is close to sitting in a studio. At least there's probably sitting in a reasonably quiet office with a headset microphone, and they're used to communicating with the patient online, and therefore they probably speak relatively clearly. They speak at a measured pace. They're professional in their job, and they know how to talk to people who are probably under great stress. The patients, on the other hand, have no such constraints. They talk as fast or as slow as they like, and they can be easy to understand or difficult to understand. One advantage that we do have is that we have this expectation that at some point the doctor should be able to understand what the patient is saying, or else there wouldn't be a conversation, because there would be no point. And therefore, as we see in the recording that we have, the doctor will occasionally ask the patient to repeat the answer, or the patient will ask the doctor to repeat the question. And so it's still possible for us to discover the text that was intended to be spoken, even if the individual sort of sections within the audio are unintelligible. Another problem that we have is the doctor might be sitting on a reasonably powerful PC with a headset microphone, but the patient could be on their mobile phone with low power battery, poor network connectivity, They might have a low-end phone that isn't powerful enough to encode as fast as possible. And they certainly are not adept at using their speakers, especially in the case where you're doing a video conference where they're holding the phone in front of themselves and then they get distracted and look away and start speaking. And you can hear that in this conversation fairly frequently. So it's not a headset conversation from the point of view of the patient, it is from the doctor. Let me see, is this gonna be something I need to do again? Let me change my audio device again. I have another sample here. This is, I can't remember exactly what this is because I played it last week, but let me play it anyway. I think it's quite short.
¿Tienes alergias?
¿Perdón?
¿Tienes alergia?
Loratadine.
¿Ese por qué te lo dan? ¿Tienes
Alergias
alergias?
¿Perdón?
¿Tienes alergias?
Cuando hace mucho frío o a las flores, a los animales, esta es la que me tomo, una pastilla diaria.
Okay.
El frasco me la tomo primero para tomarme todas las demás pastillas. Omeprazol.
Okay.
Okay, I'll play that one more time. Listen.
Loratadine.
¿Ese por qué te lo dan? ¿Tienes alergias?
¿Perdón?
¿Tienes alergias?
Cuando hace mucho frío o a las flores, a los animales, esta es la que me tomo, una pastilla diaria.
Okay.
El frasco me la tomo primero para tomarme todas las demás pastillas. Omeprazol.
Okay.
Okay. So, can you hear me again?
Yep.
Okay. So I mean I can play that again, but it hopefully gives you an idea of that's just a random section taken from the audio. You can see this is the output from the speech recognition algorithm. You can see that there are times where even though the patient was speaking fairly fast, it does a pretty good job of transcribing the audio without having to employ a lot of grammatical analysis to the audio. But there are certain places like here and especially down here somewhere where it's just producing nonsense, right? That's not any Spanish word. But if you listen to the audio, you'll also hear that at that point in time, it's almost impossible to hear what the patient said anyway, because the signal quality dropped dramatically. And then round about this time around here, the patient clearly sounds like they're putting on some cooking, they're doing some cooking or something, because there's a lot of noise happening in the background where they're doing things on their desk or something. So you hear background noise in between, and the patient's head is wandering and not facing the microphone, so there's volume changing and so on. So this is just an illustration of a real scenario of what the audio sounds like, and the output from the speech recognizer, and you know how it's trying to match up. And our goal in the first attempt or for the initial phase is to, at a minimum, identify where these phrases are happening in the conversation, to produce a first pass at the transcription algorithm, which we will then enhance and improve the quality of this. But then to allow the doctor to be able to say, oh, this doesn't make sense, what did they mean by that? And literally just click on the sentence and hear at that instant what the patient actually said. And so for that, I can actually show you a demo. I will probably have to, where is my browser? Disconnect. How do I do this? Okay. I just have to change screen in order to do this, so it might take me a few seconds. So if you can have a chat about things and give me like a minute to set up the connection. So what I want to do is actually run this on the server that we have right now. To do that, I have to connect to the server. Am I connected yet? No, I'm not. That's what I thought. Okay, so are there any questions? Please give me a few seconds to connect here.
Well, I guess
Any
one
questions?
thing is I just want to check the time real quickly to make sure.
Yes.
Yeah, because it's been an hour. Just want to kind of point that out.
Okay. Yeah. I'm just about to show a demo, and then that will be.
Cut you off, Pico. Go ahead.
I just wanted to let you know, David and James, that we have a shy audience. It's not that they're not interested, I'm hoping.
You can ask in Spanish, it's okay.
So team, any questions? This is super interesting.
Yeah, I have a question. Are you, so as far as I understand it, like you're saying, is like the Spanish tool that you have are still in progress, developing more accuracy on the not translations, but the transcriptions, yeah, that you're doing,
Correct.
right? Okay.
That's exactly right, yes. So the initial goal was, I mean, there's quite a lot of work to get to an accurate transcriber. If you try to transcribe this recording from Zoom, you will see that there are quite a lot of errors that are made, and especially anything that's trying to transcribe in real time is likely to make quite a lot of mistakes. There are several tools that you can do that where you can see the transcription live as people are talking. It is quite a challenging thing to do. I tried to illustrate some of the extra challenges that we face on top of this in terms of the fact that people aren't wearing a headset and used to talking on Zoom. They're in fact holding their phone in front of their hand, and oh, hang on a minute, just bear with me a second. Sorry, I can't enter a password and speak at the same time. Okay, I think we're done. Run this localhost. Am I connected? Such. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Great. Excellent. Now, how do I get back to the audio so I can share my screen again? Okay, select screen, entire screen. Okay, all right. Sorry, I was answering your question. Yes. I mean, this is an initial challenge. We did a very first initial transcription using a traditional speech recognizer, which actually produces text that seems a lot more reasonable than what we're about to show you. But when we looked at what the patient had actually said and the words that came out from the transcription, the reason it looked a lot more reasonable is that the recognizer was being quite selective in the areas of the speech that it chose to output text for. And so it was literally just losing parts of the conversation because it couldn't figure out with enough accuracy what it was. And obviously we can't afford to do that. We need to be able to transcribe everything. And so we've erred on the side of transcribing stuff that might look like nonsense in the hope that we can now improve the quality of that nonsense and turn it back into readable language. And we have I will talk about that. I know we're kind of nearing a sort of maybe end of time, but what we've done is take about 200,000 audio files of where we have both the Spanish recording and the text that they were supposed to have said, and we're running it through the same recognizer, and we're actually using it to learn how the recognizer makes mistakes. And in particular, where people are having a conversation and the recognizer makes mistakes because people are joining words together, like words that end in an S and begin with an S all sound like they're just run into a single word. Or there are cases where certain sounds are combined together, or the vowels are reversed. One example, which I've mentioned to Pico and Carlos before, at some point the doctor mentions, I forget the entire phrase, but she says con unas as part of that. And when you actually play the audio and listen to what she says, she doesn't actually say the U sound at all, because there's an N at the end of con, and there's an N in the second letter, unas, and so she just keeps saying the N, and then just moves her mouth to the U shape, but the sound is coming out through her nose, so it's not a U. And so we can now detect that because we know that that is something that people do when they pronounce words that have certain sounds, especially the difference between sounds that come out of your nose and your mouth. there's quite a lot of effort involved in moving between them. So we often, when we're speaking quickly, will tend to try to stay in either nasal or vocal mode. Okay, so let me just flip to this. Can you see this? Should say MiSalud customer demo.
Yes.
Okay, so this is very quick. I'll just show you some examples. This is the result of having transcribed all that audio. This is what a prototype, right? It's not supposed to look nice. It's just supposed to be functional for what the doctor might be interested in. So they can type in this case, but or better or something, a word that you would expect the patient to say many times, and clearly they do. And here are all the sentences within that conversation where the patient said better. And then I can actually view the whole conversation, and you can see it's highlighted. There's all the text of the part of the conversation that we have. So we don't have the full hour. We have about 36 minutes of it. And you can see all the different sentences. And if I go back to do this again, I'll just mention what I'm about to do, and then I'll do it. I should be able to click on any one of these sentences, and you will see that this is the whole audio here. You can listen to the whole conversation. It's 35 minutes long, or you can just click on any one of these sentences, and it will just jump to the position in the audio where that sentence was spoken, so you can hear immediately what it is. And I'll just turn my turn to the other speaker so you can hear this, hopefully. So if I click down here.
Fecha de nacimiento. ¿En dónde vives ahorita?
No supimos de que murió. No, porque me han estado checando aquí cada año, me hacen el físico. Hago 3.
So that's an example where she says hago tres. She means tres, but she doesn't pronounce the S, right?
Bueno. No, pero si no podemos continuar así. No,
Ok.
Si le tiene que regresar la llamada, yo la espero.
Bastante, porque no tengo carro y se me inflama y muchos gases. Por la depresión y la ansiedad que me dio con mi esposo.
Del año pasado.
Me hicieron una como...
¿A ti alguna vez te han...?
Ok, de primero 3 escalas.
Okay, so hopefully that gives you an idea. The concept behind doing this is that until we can produce more accurate speech, we would rather produce cases where what is written actually sounds like what the patient said. And if the doctor doesn't understand it, they have the option to immediately hear, like instantly hear the sentence that was spoken for the text that they're reading. And then they can always just carry on playing from that point. So this is all it's doing is moving the position within the playhead here. And then from then on, I can just hit play and carry on playing the sound. So it allows them to also jump to sections of the conversation where maybe they're talking about diabetes, or they're talking about smoking, or they're talking about whether they have any inherited conditions or anything like that, like up here. And I think just that alone is extremely helpful to the doctor to be able to, instead of just listening to 40, my guess is this whole conversation is probably about an hour long. It's infeasible for a new doctor who's taking on a patient because they're covering for someone else to have to listen to several hours of audio in order to make sense of it. They would like to go straight to the piece where they're talking about maybe a particular illness, and they can jump to it and hear exactly what was said, and then quickly navigate around it. So the first objective was to be able to rapidly search and navigate around the text that was spoken, even in the presence of occasional cases where there are clearly words that are not the correct Spanish words, but actually sound remarkably close to what the patient actually said or the doctor said. They tend to be often what the patient said, and sometimes things like this are usually to do with the fact that they weren't even speaking into the microphone, or the quality of the signal was so bad that it's really difficult to understand. So at the moment, we've chosen to keep in what sounds like nonsense, because at the very least, what is left should be the words that a normal speech recognizer would recognize correctly, and all the other sounds are still in the audio, so we're not losing anything. And that is especially important if they're talking about medical terms or drug names or something like that that would have been dropped from the conversation by a typical speech recognizer. We can't afford to do that. That's probably some of the most important parts of the audio. So we would rather have the misspelling of that drug and then find a way to match the spelling to the nearest drug. And in addition to this, we have a model which contains pretty much every known commercially available drug name, as well as about 10 to 15,000 terms that are used every day by doctors and patients when talking about medical conditions. So pretty much every part of the body, and many different kinds of illnesses, and we have a dictionary of those which we've extracted from several different kind of medical dictionaries. And then separate from that, we have a 600,000 word language or word dictionary for all the words that we know of in Spanish, which includes all the tenses and the singulars and plurals and so on. So, I mean, I could probably carry on talking for another hour, but I hope that this has been somewhat entertaining. That was my plan, to give you some idea of the work that we're trying to do and some of the challenges, and hopefully also to understand how some of this stuff works. Because I think I'm very passionate about it, but I like it when other people enjoy it as well, if they can. So, yeah.
Super interesting. Well, there was one question from Louis about have we tried it with the conversation with more than 2 participants? We have not.
Well, at the moment, it's based on a single audio file per person. And so technically, it wouldn't make any difference to us if there were 20 people. Like in this conversation, if there were 5 people speaking at the same time, if we got 5 different audio files, it wouldn't be any different than just the doctor and the patient at the moment. Right. So we're not putting any effort into trying to determine who is speaking. We already know who's speaking, and we have completely set. Well, actually, no, it's not entirely true. There are some cases where the sound leaks through because the patient speaker is very loud. But most of the time, you only hear the patient on one audio file, and you only hear the doctor on another audio file. And if there were more doctors or more patients, and there were separate audio files, that would be fine. On the other hand, if the doctor is speaking to a family and 3 of them are speaking at the same time, then that would be difficult. Yes.
Thank you.
But in a conference call with multiple doctors, we would expect to be able to do exactly the same thing as we're doing right now.
Cool. I guess the floor is back to MiSalud's team.
So I think Pico has to leave.
Okay.
Or something. Yeah. So I don't know how much time we have left. We have a couple of minutes. I mean, I would like the team, if you guys have more questions, keep them coming. But I would like you to James and David to talk a little bit more about the repo, the project. How do you deploy it? I don't know if that was part of the agenda for today.
Well,
we had
originally my understanding was Pico wanted me to talk specifically about the stuff that had been. I'm happy to talk about it. So the application itself is really 2 different parts. There is the audio analysis part. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then there's a separate piece that is a sort of prototype, just a simple API server written in Django that is and a React front end. And as you saw, we're not trying to do UI design. We're not trying to create a fancy looking thing. We're just trying to prototype what something could look like, in the hope that it's fairly straightforward for someone to take and then fitting into your application, so you could use this with your doctors. So we built a prototype because we felt that an essential part of this process is not just the audio transcription, but actually in producing a result that someone could use. And so we wanted to show how we would be able to have a mechanism for doctors to be able to jump around parts of audio and do searching. The search engine is using Solr. We store all of the transcriptions in I think in a Postgres database, but all of that stuff is really prototype, if you like. The assumption is that if you were going to build that in production, you might want to choose to do it in a different way. The audio algorithms themselves are all currently written in Python, although clearly all the speech recognition itself is in some higher performance library, in this case PyTorch for wave to text. It will run on GPUs and it does run on CPUs. On the current machine that I just ran this on, which is a Google Cloud 2-core machine with 16 gig of RAM, it takes about 13 minutes, I believe, to process all the audio for the conversation that you saw. And that's multiple passes across 35 minutes of audio from two sides and stereo audio. So that's equivalent of about 70 minutes of audio. And if you've ever tried to encode an MP3 file, you'll realize that encoding a 70-minute MP3 file is not something that happens very quickly. For comparison, however, I run it on a more powerful machine. In this case, it's a 16-core, 32 hypercore machine with a NVIDIA RTX 3090 GPU, and it takes about 35-40 seconds. So it is technically possible to do it much quicker. Even a much simpler GPU, but 3060 Ti, it's not much more. It's about 40-50 seconds. So it doesn't require a super powerful GPU, but even a simple GPU will make quite a big difference in acceleration. Running it only on CPU with a 16-core machine took about 3 minutes. So there is a lot of opportunity for speeding this up, but it's obviously something that could also be done offline or on multiple servers. So there are various different options, and the deployment that we have right now, you can just simply change it from CPU to CUDA, and it will just run on a GPU. So it will support both, depending on what the capability of your machine is. So the audio processing is using various different audio libraries. It's using FFmpeg, as I mentioned, for the audio codec level analysis, so understanding all the packet frames. We call out to FFmpeg and tell it to analyze all the audio and return a big JSON output that tells us the output of I gave you one frame sample, but it gives us that for hundreds of thousands of frames, and we decode that and figure out from the numbers in those frames how to reconstruct the audio. The algorithm that's doing the speech recognition, as I mentioned, is PyTorch, and it's Torch Audio, using libraries that are available on Hugging Face. You can look at wave to text online. You'll see there's a lot of description documentation about it. We also use natural language models. We use natural language model from NTOK. We use Spacey. Pretty much, I mean, in the prototyping, we use pretty much every tool that is known to work with the Spanish language, but we've narrowed it down to the handful that actually are reasonably reliable and useful. So for the most part, Spacey and PyTorch, and we also use the Vosk speech recognizer as an alternative recognizer, which is more of a grammatical traditional recognizer for comparison. And that allows us to identify which words would have been obvious to a normal speech recognizer. And therefore, what are the ones that it had trouble recognizing, and that indicates to us that it could be either a mispronunciation, a poor quality, or perhaps a medical term. And then I already mentioned about the medical dictionary, which is essentially just a big list of like probably around 20-30,000 words, and then there's a separate Spanish language dictionary of 600,000 words. And the whole thing is running on Linux on a Google Cloud server at the moment. or using Python 3.8. I don't know how much more you want me to describe. I can go in more detail.
Yeah, maybe next question.
Is that what you were looking for, Carlos?
Yeah, David, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, if anyone has any questions about how the system works or what libraries we use or anything like that, feel free to ask. Yeah, the code should all be up in GitHub in hopefully in a few hours if it's not already up there. But then you should have all the source code as well. And it's all running on your server, your Google Cloud server, and all installed and working. So
We have a question, David. Erie has a question.
Yes.
Yeah, another question. Yeah. So yeah, I'm curious about the engineers. Who else? What kind of people is involved in this project? Because I know, for example, people involved in understanding language, and like there's a lot of background over there, and I'm curious about it. What is the kind of people that is involved in the project?
So our team is our data scientists. They are mathematicians and scientists who have been trained for at least 2 years in commercial data science projects. They're all postgraduate mathematicians and scientists. Myself, I've been doing this for about 35 years or so. My first speech recognition project was in the 1980s when I designed a speech recognition system for high noise environments for the European community. And then I went on to design the speech recognizer for the Eurofighter Typhoon aircraft, which is a single pilot, single crew aircraft, fighter bomber, which is pretty rare. So, and I built systems for simulating air traffic control, which involves speech recognition and a lot of language transcription and technical transcription. But this is going back many years. More recently, I've done a lot of work on natural language modeling, and the team itself has done a lot of work on modeling complex documents, patents, Federal Drug Administration documents, legal documents, financial documents, and really trying to understand language in the context of a specific domain, like finance or energy or telecommunications, or in this case, medicine. So we have several projects where we work in medical field as well, like on medical trials and on insurance, analyzing patients' conditions from text.
And if I may add it, David, I mean, it's not just the audio thing that we do, but we're kind of the general data science team. But in particular, audio, we know that really, really well. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, a lot of what I was talking about was actually the language side of it. The audio side of it is part of it. We do a lot of work in image analysis as well. But the audio, the real hard part in this is language. And understanding how people speak and where they mispronounce things, and the differences in the way that people pronounce from region to region and so on. The actual audio signal processing side of this is relatively straightforward in comparison. I mean, you can do noise removal and things. In general, we prefer not to touch the sound at all if possible, because the speech recognizer will often have been trained in an environment where that noise was present. And so it should have learned how to distinguish the speech from the noise. And if you alter the sound, then you are introducing sounds that weren't there originally, and therefore it can make mistakes. But a lot of our work that we do is in the language side of this problem, more so than in the audio. I mean, other than all the stuff I started with was just trying to figure out how to understand the output from codecs. That's a whole other end, right? That's the pure engineering side of understanding how the codec encodes the data and how we can unpack it. Does that answer your question?
I think she gave us thumbs up.
Okay.
There's another question from Adriana. She asks, how long will it take to have a more accurate version for Spanish transcriptions?
So, I mean, we can have a version that looks more accurate by just simply removing the things where there is some doubt. If you actually looked at or listened to the section that I played, that was a fairly brief single sentence section, and the associated transcription, hopefully you will have heard that there are times where no matter how slow you play the audio, it's actually difficult for even a fluent Spanish human speaker to understand what was actually said because the signal is corrupt. And so there are limitations to how accurate it is possible to make this, because even a human listening to it would not be correct. Our goal is to try to get to at least to the point that a human who would not be a medical expert would be able to accurately transcribe it. The step beyond that, which is to understand the semantics of medicine and to therefore interpret what the patient might have meant by what they said, is a substantially harder problem. And for that, I mean, you have to understand, so far we have one conversation, and we've built this entire platform on that. So we're hopeful that as we get more conversations, we will learn more about the different challenges of the recording format and the loss of packets. Is this an unusual case for this particular patient, or is this something that's going to happen a lot? How much effort should we be putting into trying to reconstruct the audio that gets distorted when packets are lost and when the signal is poor? Because that will make a substantial difference. Most of the time where there is a significant amount of nonsense that appears in the text is because the sound isn't a normal sound that you would hear if you were having a conversation face to face. It's been distorted, and sometimes just parts of it are completely missing. At the same time, you will find that there are cases where there is audio that is almost imperceptibly quiet, and yet the recognizer gets it perfectly, because it doesn't care how big the waveform is, it just cares what the shape of the waveform is. And so sometimes, even though we can't hear it, it is so subtle, but it's the right shape that the recognizer does actually pick out the correct words. And then once you amplify the signal, you can actually hear what the doctor couldn't hear. So there are cases where the doctor says, "I can't hear you," and that's because you can't hear anything in the signal unless you really amplified it. So there are a number of challenges. The immediate goal is to understand the specific mispronunciations that happen because of the ways people speak when they're having a conversation. In other words, the way they join words together, because I think that would get rid of about 60 to 70% of all the errors. A lot of the time, the recognizer is essentially misdetecting the separation between words, often because it's ambiguous. There might be multiple ways to unpack a sequence of a sound into multiple words, and we should be able to understand that there are certain patterns that repeat when people speak quickly.
Thank you.
So, James, David, this is an awesome job, outstanding. Quick question. You actually have a model that requires training, so if we deliver more audios, you will be able to train this model more and more and improve the accuracy of the model, or you're processing the audio as it is and comparing it with a dictionary? I don't know if
yes, I mean, we do have a model that we could train if we had more audio. We are not using it at the moment because we only have one audio sample, and therefore it's not going to be very helpful to spend time training until we have at least a few hundred samples and preferably a few thousand samples. But what we have done instead is find separate sets of audio. And I mentioned we have about almost 250,000 audio files of spoken Spanish sentences that are nothing to do with the medical domain, but they are recorded, and there is text associated with those that is supposed to be the speech that people said. Unfortunately, if you listen to it, there's often television in the background, and they don't actually read what is written on the text. But at the very least, we do hear a lot of the same pronunciation challenges and expression challenges that happen in conversation. So we do have a model of that, and we have trained it with that data, and that was 250,000 audio files. So if we had more audio files, yes, it would make a big difference. True.
But with those more audio files, you will need the perfect text that goes with each one of those files.
No, because we're looking for specific patterns in the audio, that we're looking for cases. First of all, we can recognize all of those audio files and immediately select from that where the errors are. Okay, one of the things that I didn't mention, and this might take a long time, so I'll be very brief to describe it. One of the ways in which we analyze the audio is, instead of taking the words in the sentence, is we just treat the whole thing as a sequence of syllables, of individual sound sections. And then we analyze the audio against those syllables, and then we look at the words, which we can also break down into all the syllables, the words in the dictionary and the words in the medical dictionary, and we can identify what is the most likely sequence of syllables that would match the words in the dictionary and in the medical dictionary. And that actually works very well, and that's how we're currently modeling the errors between when people mispronounce things because they're in a conversation. And the way that we do that is we take all the syllables that are spoken in the language and we convert them into letters in exactly the same way that we convert DNA pairs into G, C, A, and T when we're doing DNA matching. And then we're using the same algorithms that are used for DNA sequencing in order to match long sentences of syllables. So it might contain hundreds of syllables, and find the globally optimum way to realign those syllables. And that model does train. It is learning and is particularly learning to identify the candidate cases where those errors occur.
Awesome, thank you.
Good questions.
Yes.
Anyone else? I mean, I did schedule 2 hours for this call, so I guess we're kind of right on the mark. Got 15 minutes remaining.
I would really like to know where are the next steps on this.
Good question. Too.
Okay, so yeah. So the first thing is we wanted to get to the point where there was something that could be presented to doctors so that we could get some feedback as to whether that approach is something that would be useful, and so that we could independently learn how the end users would consume the results of what we produce. Right? Because we can spend a lot of time doing research, but at some point, it's never going to be 100% perfect. The question is, at what point is this a significantly more useful thing than what is currently available, right? Is this better than listening to the entire conversation? I would suggest that listening to an hour's worth of a patient in order to find out if they mentioned diabetes is a lot more effort than typing it into a search engine and finding that it was mentioned 30 times in the last 12 conversations. So I think that was a quick win. It allowed us to get to the point where we can present this to end users and get their feedback. Because at the end of the day, the whole point of this is to make their life easier and to make the system more efficient, right? And so we're not just trying to be academics and produce the highest quality speech recognizer. We're really trying to save time and make the doctor's time more efficient and less arduous. And it's not always the most clever solution that does that. It's the most practical solution. So we want to, now that we have something, present that in front of doctors and get some feedback whilst we're waiting for additional audio files. As far as the speech recognition research is concerned, the next step is to take these audio files that we have and to build this model that is doing the disambiguation of words that we know are not in the dictionary, and to try to select out from those where it's just simply that 2 or 3 words were glued together, because we believe we can do that with very high accuracy. And that's the work that we're doing right now. And that will significantly improve the results. And then we worry at later on, worry about how to try to reconstruct audio that is missing, and some of the other challenges which are extremely technical and which may not make a huge difference in the overall scheme of things. Because our understanding is that if the audio is so bad that because the quality is really bad, the doctor would have probably asked the patient to repeat the answer, or the doctor would have repeated the question if the patient didn't understand it. And so that's lower priority for us than to try to get as much of the text to be correct words in Spanish. And we think within a fairly short time we will have something that will dramatically improve on the errors that work in a conversation. There is no speech recognition model that's designed to work really well in a conversation. Even Google's speech recognizer isn't particularly good at that. So we have a unique problem that we're trying to solve, and we're trying to solve it in 2 ways. One is to make it the most useful result, and the other is to produce the best quality result within reason. But we don't want to be, we're not trying to be academics and produce something that has the best result because we're publishing a paper. We're really trying to help doctors.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
David, we have another question from Adriana about the legal owner of the recorded stored audios. I guess I could maybe speak to that. So I think for MiSalud's application, the ownership of the content is probably spelled out in terms of use and privacy policy. As for our own content, it's basically publicly available stuff that we just found. Right, David?
That's correct. So everything that is, the audio files, I think it was 5 or 6 audio files that we have from MiSalud are under whatever terms and conditions you have with your patients. I would assume, like any other internet company where you offer some kind of chat conversation, the terms of service include the right to record and preserve the audio and repurpose it if necessary, because otherwise it would be, you'd be up for so many potential lawsuits just allowing people to talk on your network. And as James said, all the other data that we're using is publicly available. So sometimes it's not easy to find, and sometimes you have to request it from researchers, but they will donate it for a good cause. And in this case, it's to help people get healthier. So So it's either, if you're an academic and you're studying and you're a struggling student, they will say yes. If you, on the other hand, you write to them nicely and say, we're trying to find a way to help many people in Latin America who have reduced access to healthcare have a better way of life, and they go, okay, that sounds like a good reason for me to give you my data. So it's all freely given data.
Actually, Alex has a good question though. I mean, basically, all the patient information, patient data, right? It is under HIPAA regulation. The question is actually HIPAA a US thing or is it a worldwide thing? So if it's a US thing, where it's stored is actually more relevant than probably whether we can actually store the data or not.
I mean, at runtime, everything will be entirely within MiSalud's servers and domain, right? We will not, other than for research purposes, we will never have seen any of the conversations with the patient. In fact, even in this case, the only part of the audio that we've heard is the introductory piece where the doctor is asking basic questions about, the medical history of the patient. As soon as the patient starts talking about their condition and their problem, the audio cuts off, which is fine with us. But yeah, I mean, eventually the only machines that will know anything about the patient's audio will be the machines that are essential in any case for the conversation to happen, right? You must already have some kind of legal coverage to allow the doctor to speak to the patient Otherwise, your servers are still receiving that audio and passing it on.
Yeah, we're already taking care of
Yeah,
all that, encrypting data and all that stuff.
Yeah. So I mean, there's no plan to have any of that required to be in any way exposed outside of MiSalud in production.
Yep.
And that's also why we're trying to use our own speech recognition solution rather than just farm it out to Google or AWS or someone else, because you'd essentially be sending every audio file from your patients to companies that are survive almost entirely by just grabbing everybody else's data. So
Very true.
you can guarantee that every speech recognition ever done by Google is stored somewhere on a disk. Right? Every Google Translate conversation is stored somewhere.
So kind of piggyback on Alex's earlier question about what are the next steps. I mean, that's something that we're actively discussing right now with Pico. And I'm sure we're going to come to some resolution and direction fairly soon. Right, Pico? Just want to make sure.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, this what you just heard and the first deliverable that we received from David and James. It's basically the first step. Next steps, we need to figure out where we want to take this and work together with them to get there. But we're pretty happy with this first concept.
And our understanding is that primarily this is about trying to solve a very specific problem that once it goes into production would be deployed in the same way that everything else within MiSalud is created and deployed. So we would provide some libraries that will do the actual transcription, but the thing that you saw with where you type in a search engine, in theory, my guess is that will probably be redone somehow, because it was a prototype. You're welcome to use it. It's your code, but there's no expectation that was supposed to be the end product that gets used by the doctor, other than for research.
Right.
Yeah, but we definitely need to start using it, start ingesting new audios that we're getting. Seeing how it behaves, sharing that with David and James, and in parallel, we need to figure out what are the next steps to move this to a next stage and have a better product and work towards that.
That's
terrific. Yeah.
Cool.
So with that, should we start wrapping up the call?
Yep.
Excellent. So I have the audio recording. I guess a video and audio recording of this session. So I'll talk to Pico about how to make it available to MiSalud. And that's really all we have on our end.
Cool.
David, thanks so much.
And thank you so much. I expected 4 people. So this is quite an audience.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was super interesting, super exciting to be working with you guys, and thanks for your time, and talk to you soon.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem. I'm glad you didn't hear the rain. It's just been raining very heavily in the last 20 minutes. So
all good.
That's
yes.
great.
Great session. Thanks so much again.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Good stuff, guys. Thank you very much. Lovely to meet you all. Take care.
Thank you.
You too. Bye.
Bye bye.
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 Thanks, David.